Hi there, my name is Dr. Brian Cook, based at the University of Melbourne. I'm a human geographer who studies risk and human behavior using participatory and action-oriented engagements. Today I will present on research that engages with cassava farmers in northwest Cambodia. The work explores their decision-making and their uptake, or not, of agricultural technologies and practices. The paper for this talk is now drafted. Thank you for the nudge to produce it, and I'm happy to share it if people promise to provide feedback and not share it too extensively. I'll keep to time. I really value questions and discussion, so please feel free to ask me anything afterwards. Today I'll begin with a brief description of the research so that you can understand the basis of the argument I'm going to offer. I've relied heavily on excerpts from interviews with farmers and their households. Each of these are representative views drawn from the many engagements that we've undertaken under the past 5 years. In brief, so that you know where this talk is heading, the argument that I'll make is that agrarian change is a product of an assemblage of experiential learning and social relations. What I mean by this is that farmers have extremely limited capacity and opportunities to affect change in their lives. No doubt they are adaptive, creative, and highly adept at agricultural transitions, but they are also subject to innumerable and often exploitative relations, which structure their options and actions. For this audience and your focus on effective farmer communications, my talk will, I think, act as a counterweight or a reminder that communications aimed at farmers must account for their situations. What our research shows is that awareness is not a problem for these farmers. They're well aware of many options. And that change is much more a product of opportunity and support. As an aside, the follow-up project that I'm leading will actively support farmers in accordance with their expressed desires and measure the impact of this support-based form of agricultural extension. There's a lot of data as part of the project that this is based on. I'm not going to go into great detail on the methodology here. Most of the data that is informing this presentation is drawn from the 300 household interviews. I won't belabor this next point, though if you're interested, I've written a review paper with a colleague on the deficit model and communications in the context of climate change, which is open access and linked to the slide, as well as a review of agricultural extension, which is also open access and written with colleagues. In general, I don't believe that communications prompt lasting behavior change in people who wouldn't already be well on their way to making those changes. I appreciate that the communications discourse is where some of the most compelling critiques of one-way communications or deficit-based framings can be found, so please don't feel that I'm painting with too broad of a brush. But it's important to ask ourselves what we expect of communications. If the assumption is that an external party can inform, educate, manipulate, nudge, or otherwise attempt to influence farmer behaviors, I don't think this is an effective theory or model of change. For me, communications are part of a wide assemblage of activities contributing to behavior over time, though it is a small and relatively weak lever with which to affect farmers' behaviors on its own. I hope that doesn't upset too many of the communications people here. I think that the data that we'll now turn to will help to justify this position. The baseline survey describes the cassava farming households who were sampled for this research, offering some insights into the general character of the households. These are predominantly households of 4 to 6 individuals with a male head who is married and who has completed primary school level education. There's a variety of circumstances within these samples, which is especially pronounced with regard to the amount of accessible land and the nature of the land titles. Most importantly, with regard to the issue of agricultural extension, the households identify specific agrarian changes that they believe would be beneficial. Transitioning to fruit trees, by far the most popular, though these transitions are bounded by an individualized framing in which responsibility rests almost entirely with the household and the extended family. The isolation and portrayal of agrarian change is an individualized activity, and that's both supported by the qualitative and quantitative findings, while also hinting at the informal social relations that contribute to on-farm practice change. Let's now move to the qualitative findings in order to better understand the rationalizations that structure farmer decision-making in the context of agrarian change and agricultural extension. The overwhelming majority of cassava farmers describe the process of transitioning to cassava production as an outcome of multiple social relations, many occurring simultaneously through different social networks. In general, the farmers become aware of a possible alternative crop through their social networks, which act as a mechanism of awareness raising. For our sampled farmers, this was overwhelmingly their neighbors. More than 95% of them identify their neighbors as their primary source of information, and for the majority of them, it's their only source of trusted information. In many instances, this neighbor or neighborly relation has access or ties with Thailand or Vietnam, or with the traders who visit rural parts of Cambodia to purchase directly from farmers. When asked what made you start planting cassava, most farmers described a successful neighbor who had already implemented the transition. So how do farmers verify information or practices that they hear about? Perhaps the most important finding of the research is recognition that agricultural extension is not a top-down activity involving experts, the state, or donors. Instead, agricultural extension is an assemblage of local social practices that are almost entirely informal and, for the most part, are not for profit. Family and already trusted relations are how farmers assess the effectiveness of information or awareness of a new practice or technology or crop. They talk to their friends, their family, and in some cases they observe wealthy individuals in the neighborhood. Throughout the more than 300 engagements, these relations create an ability for farmers to vicariously experience alternate practices, which is their way of informing their decision making. So where do farmers get official information or advice from? The final question of the quantitative survey asked, who has the power to support their efforts to implement a change? And a large number of respondents answered with variations on family. We created the categories to be as fine as possible, but around 80% of respondents included one or more of the myself, head of household, family, children, grandchildren, husband, wife, parent. Only 14% of all the respondents indicated or included reference to an external body as part of the relations that affect their behaviors. Farmers are disconnected from what we understand to be agricultural extension or extension services and communications, which means that many official and expert efforts to support farmers are disconnected from how they inform themselves. The only official relation that farmers have is with chemical input vendors, which we'll turn to now. So what do farmers make of the pesticide vendor? Across the 300 interviews, there's a contradiction between feelings of isolation and the universal presence of the pesticide vendor. As mentioned in the preceding excerpts, the pesticide vendor is a constant non-family social relation, and in most cases is the only expert with whom the farmers have contact. This finding is relatively unsurprising, as the commercial sector has been promoted as part of wider efforts to transition agricultural extension to a for-profit business model. What is surprising is the monopoly that vendors appear to have with regard to technical advice and practice. In the vast majority of instances, the pesticide vendor was the only social relation that farmers had with anyone from the agricultural sector, outside of traders. They rely on these individuals, but they are doubtful and suspicious because of past experiences and the experiences of others which they've heard through their social networks. They're aware of the profit motivation of official extension activities and therefore revert to their neighbors and trusted social relations to assess any new information and practice. That really summarizes how farmers inform themselves. So in conclusion, what have we seen in the last 10 minutes? Well, farmers are alone and subject to extreme precarity and exploitation. Any action taken is debt-fueled and costly, making change an extremely difficult and complex choice. They don't lack for information, but trustworthy support. The guiding question was, how powerful are social relations in the context of agricultural extension and agrarian change? I would say that they're everything to these farmers. They continuously describe social relations as the basis for them informing themselves. We asked, what factors drive behavioral change amongst Cambodian cassava farmers? Well, it's their neighbors. It's their family members, who are often their neighbors, and trusted social relations. And that's pretty much always their neighbors and their family and their friends. And I think that that's critically important for those of us involved in agricultural agrarian change and agricultural extension, and especially for people involved in communications. What does that mean then for communications? Well, what is the role for communication? I think that's time for the discussion and to turn this over to the group. Thank you very much for your attention and engagement. We have lots of different ways to access some of the findings and the research, and to get in touch, please do. And thank you very much to our donor and the various partners who are involved in this research. Thanks.